Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week, we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us this week in Chicago. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, this week we're going to be dedicating the entirety of the show to a single data point. And that data point is $3 trillion. That was the valuation reached by Apple this week, making it the first company in history to cross that threshold.
Look at Apple. With those gains, it crosses the $3 trillion market cap level.
It's just this incredible run that Apple has been on this year, really leading the pack, keeping up with the rest of...
Now, I don't think it ends here. We believe this is a $4 trillion market cap by 2025. And at the end of the day, Apple continues to play chess while others are playing checkers.
We all know what Apple provides its customers. Many of our listeners may be accessing this podcast on an Apple iPhone, but yeah, we wanted to take a segment to zoom out and consider Apple as an economic and political player in its own right. So, Adam, what sort of entrepreneurship exactly does Apple's success represent? I mean, when I was thinking about this, I was wondering, has it specialized in innovating goods exactly? It struck me that smartphones existed, for example, prior to the iPhone. Or on the other hand, has it specialized in some production process, although its products aren't really priced in a way to maximize its consumer base? So if it's neither of those, does the classical concept of entrepreneurship include driving innovations of refinement and taste, as I guess anyone would say Apple has managed to do?
Yeah, this is the sort of abiding question about Apple. What is the secret of this, extraordinary company's success? I think if you go back to the early stages of the company, the knock was in a sense that they weren't the most innovative, that they were, however, geniuses at marketing. And certainly I'm old enough to remember the incredible impact that the first Apple Macs made. And amongst impressionable kids at the time, it was just the hottest thing imaginable. Somehow, like in my mind, it segued with Star Wars and the kind of, the comeback of America in the 1980s. I think by the time we get to the 90s, that product design dominance has really come very much to the fore. You've got these legendary figures like Ive. I don't know whether it's Joni or Johnny Ive, the brilliant designer of so many of the Apple products from the late 90s onwards, and that's a really dominant feature. There's always been the hard-nosed element of Apple, which was the fact that it was a closed software hardware environment, unlike the open architecture of the PC. So there was always that kind of feature that they were tough competitors and out to build moats, as Warren Buffett would call it. But then I do think that in the latest generation, and really with Tim Cook and the iPhone, the central story of the firm, and it's really an extraordinary story, is indeed the manufacturing prowess. That's really what sets Apple apart from all of its competitors, is this extraordinary ecosystem of manufacturing that they've created that enables them to mass produce this extraordinarily sophisticated combination of software and hardware, above all from a manufacturing base in China, but with a huge amount of proprietary technology that's going into the manufacturing process. So I think they're really up there with Henry Ford. There was nothing ever particularly exciting about the Model T from a design point of view, and engineering terms, it was almost willfully crude. But the genius was the mass production. And I think that's the underplayed story with Apple. It's a little bit unsexy and quite problematic in many ways. But if you want to know what really gives them this key dominant position, it's this incredibly ramified network. Outsourcing doesn't really do it justice. It's a integrated global production system.
So I definitely want to dig into that relationship with its producers, but first I wanted to ask about the relationship between Apple and the U.S. government. Does Apple play a role in the U.S. government the way that other national champion corporations do in other countries, or is Apple distinct from other corporate giants when it comes to corporate government relations, because it's not exactly an industrial labor behemoth, domestically at least?
Yeah, I mean, the role of national champions in relation to the US is a little complicated because the US economy is just so massive. I mean, thinking about it, there was a period where you could say that Detroit was sort of synonymous with America and American power. You know, famously, what's good for GM is good for America, and maybe it's the other way around. What's good for America is good for GM. Like a succession of car executives were secretaries of state around the Pentagon, you know, so there was a real kind of merger between Detroit and American power. But I think there's a peculiar phase in the history of the US. In the present period, you'd be hard pressed to say, you know, it's not like a Samsung with Korea or the German car industry with Germany. The economy is simply too big and too diversified, you know, as big as the American banks are. There's too many of them and they're too small relative to American GDP to be like UBS is with Switzerland now. And the other thing about Apple is it really is a consumer-facing company. I mean, it makes goods which American public servants buy, but it isn't like it's providing backbone services like a Google, for instance, or, you know, deep technological products. I mean, there's huge engineering expertise in the chips on the Apple phones, but you know, it isn't a major leader in AI, for instance. It has AI elements in its business, but it isn't the dominant player in that zone. It's not an NVIDIA, for instance, which is just doing this, you know, face of God's level kind of engineering. Not that the engineering in an iPhone's anything, you know, it's no slouch, but it's not that kind of, I think, Pentagon relevant firm. And the position it's adopted with regard to the demands of the American security services is nothing short of non-cooperative, right? So there was this famous standoff between Apple and the FBI in 2015, 2016, where Apple basically refused to cooperate with American government demands that it crack the encryption on its own phones. And the American government ended up hiring hackers, possibly with the assistance of Israeli intelligence, to break into one of Apple's phones. And then this thing repeated in 2020. And it straddles. It's a very unusual company in that sense. It truly is, I think, an epitome of a kind of globalized vision of where corporations stand in relation to good national governments. It actually had engaged in negotiations with the Chinese to demonstrate to the Chinese that there are no backdoor entrances into Apple's technology. So, you know, everyone has there's a sort of equal opportunities approach to denying access to everyone. I mean, it's well known that if you travel in China, the safest phone that you can take is an Apple, but it's also clearly the case that America's security services have a hard time getting into it as well. So it's an interesting. No one would accuse Apple of being disloyal, I think, though Trump periodically did. Barr, his attorney general, had a go. But it's certainly not straightforwardly aligned in the military-industrial complex in the way that you might expect.
Another thing about Apple is that it famously has huge cash reserves. And to some extent, it's poured that money into other tech projects that have come to fruition. But isn't it also in a strong position to become an enormous financial institution of its own? I mean, why would or wouldn't it be sensible for Apple to focus on becoming a financial business?
Yeah, I mean, it's got so much more money than a bank, right? Because the money that when we talk about bank balance sheets, it's almost all borrowed. You know, whether borrowed in a commercial money market or borrowed from depositors. When we put our money in the bank, after all, we're lending it to the bank. They don't like saying that to us, but that's exactly what's going on. Whereas Apple is actually just sitting on piles of cash, which it's earned in profit. So it's a vastly stronger company structurally stronger than any bank, really. It has also huge amounts of data, and it is, of course, now involved in payments technology. And so, yes, there's been a hookup now in the last 12 months between Apple and Goldman Sachs. And they've started offering savings products to encourage people to put money onto the accounts, which they'll then access by way of Apple Pay. There is even a buy now, pay later facility that Apple offers. But this is really characteristic of Apple. That's just them putting some of their huge cash pile to good use. You know, normally a bank would offer you this, buy now, pay later, but the bank would borrow the money to lend you the money so that you can then pay it a greater interest margin. Apple is literally just sitting on the cash. So it might as well lend it to various customers. So I think the idea absolutely is, it's, I think, uncertain how big a piece of the Apple ecosystem it will be, but the combination of the wallet, the payments facility, the cash loan lending that they can do, they're in a position to really build a very important position in finance. The question is, why would they do it? And as a business, it's much less attractive than the one they're already in. So the payoff would presumably be that if all of your domestic finances are in an Apple ecosystem, you're much less likely to swap to some other company's phone. So I would have thought the logic here is that you use the financial integration of your customers, not to earn huge margins on that per se. Apple's interest rates it's offering on these savings accounts are quite attractive. You wouldn't imagine it becoming like maybe a car company, which for a long time made a lot of money on various types of hire purchase, leasing schemes. It would probably be more a mechanism for consolidating Apple's grip more comprehensively on its customers' lives. That kind of conception, I think, would be where it would fit in. If you're comparing businesses, like, there's nothing for Apple to envy about the business that Goldman Sachs is in. Like, seriously, like, why would they want to do that? The only reason they'd want to do that is because it means people are much more likely to buy their phones and everything else that Apple wants to sell us on that side of the line business.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it's hard to appreciate just how strong the Apple business is, that it can sort of, look down its nose on all these other banks. It doesn't even need to do that, and it's just in an extraordinary position, I guess.
Yeah.
So if we use Apple, say, as a case study for the process of globalization, I mean, what exactly would it have to teach us about this era of global economics? I mean, on one hand, Apple's globalization seems to be about the rising fortunes of the rest of the world. You mentioned the outsourcing of labor to contractors that are in developing markets, etc. On another level, though, Apple is a company that has exploited globalization to evade responsibility, it seems like, on a number of ways, setting up global headquarters to evade taxation. Are these aspects of globalization inseparable in some way, or is one a kind of truer depiction of what globalization has really been about?
Yeah, I mean, on the globalization as bringing development to the world point, it's also, of course, crucial to emphasize that for Apple, China is not just a manufacturing center, it's also a huge market. Like, they are some of the most demanding, tech-savvy, fashion-conscious consumers in the world. I think that they account for about 25% of Apple's sales. So genuine, making it really is, in that sense, a kind of global Fordism, in the way that Ford, imagined paying his workers well enough for them to buy the cars. Apple doesn't necessarily pay its workers well enough for them to be able to afford apples in China, but they are part of a growth miracle in China from which Apple benefits both on the side of production and consumption. Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, they kind of say it on the back of the phone, right? I mean, it's designed in California, it's manufactured in China. The one thing they don't add is that they pay their taxes through Ireland. And that's a key element of their business design. So the way it works essentially is that Foxconn pays Apple's subsidiary in Ireland which holds all of the IP for the privilege of manufacturing according to the Apple blueprints in China, right? And so then the profits of the bit that they decide to repatriate to the US is then paid as a dividend from the Irish branch to the US branch, which then allows them to reward their shareholders in the US. And of course, the shareholders in the US view not just the US branch of the company, which is really quite a light footprint, but they view the entire global corporation, and whatever's accumulating on Apple Inc. Global's balance sheet is then credited in this extraordinary stock market valuation in the US without becoming taxable in the US, or without necessarily requiring Apple to employ a lot of people in the US. So the Irish branch of Apple, which is based in Cork, has 56,000 employees worldwide, of which only 6,000 are actually in Ireland. Apple US employs tens of thousands of people, and then there is the manufacturing arm, which is like 500,000, but they're not on Apple's books, and they work largely via Foxconn and the subcontractors they use in China. So it's absolutely an indication of just how much Apple is the quintessential global coordinating firm. It really is, surpassing now, obviously, the global car companies, which through the middle of the 20th century were really the quintessential globalizing corporates. Apple is really the key player. I think, in fairness to them on tax, obviously at one level it's scandalous that they channel their profits in this way, but the door is open to them by the political decisions of the governments in the respective jurisdictions, right? Apple is not in the business of breaking the law. It doesn't need to break the law to make money. It's, that's really somebody else's game. That's a pretty poor game if you have to do that. Apple is just an incredibly smart company. And so if you open the door to it to pursue these tax efficient strategies, of course, it will take advantage of them. And it can afford the best legal advice and the best accounting advice in the world. And so, in fact, the Irish strategy proved to be bomb-proof legally, right? The European Commission wanted to force them to pay 14 billion euros worth of tax to the Irish government. The Irish government is so keen to have Apple in Ireland that it didn't want the money. The European Commission tried to force Apple to pay, and they lost the legal case. Because, in fact, Apple's position was, in the first round anyway, Apple's position was watertight. And that, unsurprisingly, right? Somebody like Tim Cook is not going to say, oh, well, give it a go. Maybe it'll turn out to be a huge illegal scam. No, they're for real. So they just take advantage. What needs to change is the underlying regulation. What needs to change is the underlying system of taxation. And I don't think there's any doubt that if you confront them with a clear set of rules on this, that they will change. Will they lobby against that? Of course they'll lobby against that, and they do quite handsomely. They're a significant lobbyist. And it's pretty clear that the Janet Yellen pushed minimum global corporate tax idea was a way of the American government avoiding, having to do tougher, more politically embarrassing strategies of clawing back tax revenue some other way, which would be embarrassing both for America's European allies and for America's corporates. So the idea was you just raise the level everywhere, and then they can keep their strategies as they are, but there'll be less circumvention. But it's a matter of governments really being willing to bite the bullet. And the success story of Apple in and of itself is a kind of shield against that. Like, who would want to mess with that kind of success?
Interesting, yeah. Maybe in some ways it sounds like Apple could be on the wrong side of what people are referring to as Bidenomics. Obviously, you mentioned Janet Yellen's corporate tax policies, but beyond that, this sort of industrial policy push where trying to make the location of these firms and the labor, et cetera, relevant to these policy questions and to economic policy questions. It seems like maybe a challenge, at least, to Apple. I don't know if they've suffered at all from Biden's administration, but it does seem like there's friction there, at least with that vision of economics.
Well, there was with Trump, because Trump had this moment where he said, we're going to make them, I'm going to make sure this company makes these goddamn computers in the United States. And the problem is the ecosystem of production, right? The problem is the supply chain itself. It's all very well to say that. It's quite another to actually make it work.
Okay, we're going to take a break right here, but we will be right back to continue talking about Apple. Okay, welcome back. We are still talking about the economics of Apple. Yeah, so, how has Apple managed its relationship with Foxconn, this company that helps manage its manufacturing labor in China? How has it managed that relationship more generally? It does seem like a very remarkable relation at the heart of Apple's success. So, how has Apple managed all of the apparent downsides or potential downsides of that kind of arm's length relationship to its own labor force?
Yeah, it's really, I think the crucial thing is to not think of this as simple subcontracting or outsourcing or something like that, let alone the kind of classic small-scale consumer good model where you take some blueprint from the West to a manufacturing hub in China and basically, sit in a local bar and say, who can make me this? Like that is not how this relationship has worked. It really is a symbiotic relationship, especially in the era of Tim Cook. So the Apple practice has basically been to invest on a huge scale in their relationship with Chinese manufacturers. And starting in the early 2000s with an incredible investment in various types of machining technology. You know, the beautiful cases that everyone likes of the laptops. I'll never forget my first impression of holding it, because I'm kind of interested in metalworking, and just picking the thing up and realizing it's milled out of a single chunk of metal, right? This is not an assembled object. It's cut out. Now, to do that, you need incredibly sophisticated computer numerical control machine tools, basically. And they're really expensive, tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a pop. And to mass manufacture, Apple basically upfront purchased the entire global supply of certain milling machines so as to be able to make these objects. Then they supply them to their subcontractors, train them up. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese companies now which are certified to the maximum level. There's this international agency which does certification for quality production. And there are literally 10 times more firms in China that are certified at that level than in any Western economy, including the United States. 10 times more. So there's this huge ecosystem of incredibly high-skilled, high-quality production, which Apple has more than any company in the world fostered. And Foxconn is at the heart of that. They were a company that was putting together, I don't know if they remember that generation of Apple computers that were kind of funky, multicolored. They looked like candy or something like that. And Foxconn started making those. And at that point, they were a $1-3 billion a year firm. And then really what they got was the contract for the early iPhones. And they hustled Apple into expanding production in China and convincing people. In the Nokia era, people just didn't believe that the manufacturing can be done on this scale in China. And Foxconn basically said, no, we can absolutely do this. We'll build 2 campuses. We think you're underestimating the scale of production you need to go to. We've got the local political contacts. We can get this done. Leave it to us. We will mobilize the workers that you need. Apple then says, right, these people need to be trained in the way that we require. Apple boasts about having provided safety training to 26 million Chinese workers because they cycle through so quickly. Everyone knows it's a bit like Ford again. The conditions on these production lines are very, very arduous. Foxconn will have at various points 300% attrition rate during a year, so it literally has to train up a workforce 2 or 3 times a year. Apple worked with them to enable this to happen, and that's really the story of this symbiosis between the 2 firms. This is genuinely a co-produced integrated production system, not a Western firm with a blueprint showing up in China and saying, build me this, and then, haphazardly taking or not taking whatever comes out of the system. Apple has invested more in the manufacturing equipment installed in China than in any of its office buildings or any facility that it has in the West. So it's basically upfront finance these giant hyper-complex factories. Now, one of the effects of this is that Apple is de facto the employer of hundreds of thousands of relatively low-paid, very hard workers working in very tough conditions in dormitory accommodation, recruited from the mass migrant labor force in China. And unsurprisingly, this meant that it was, responsible directly or indirectly for waves of discontent sweeping through that workforce, a rash of suicides that happened in Foxconn in the early 2010s. And then serious labor disputes, which have erupted and notably erupted around COVID, right? The A4 revolution in China last year, amongst other things, centered on production sites of Foxconn. So, at that level, it's really at the hub. But again, Apple manages this cooperatively with Taiwanese collaborators like Foxconn, but then also with the local Chinese authorities who treated Apple throughout the COVID epidemic as the absolute priority in the production system. Like part of Xi's pivot in February 2020 to restart production was about ensuring that Apple's lines didn't, Tesla and Apple are the 2 standout Western companies that really have sway over Chinese decision-making, much more than JP Morgan or somebody like that, the money people who would love to do more business in China, but aren't really integral to the Chinese economy. Whereas Apple really is a key element, and so Foxconn has really been the mediator in this very complex and highly political chain.
I mean, theoretically, could Apple buy Foxconn at some point if it's so dependent on its labor? Is that even like
Well,
or is
that's
that
not their business model, right? Their business
yeah.
model is to manage these kind of partnerships, to delegate, and that's exactly what they don't want to be,
Yeah.
right? And don't need to be because they've made it work so well this way.
It would just seem to be a risk, I guess, somehow of its own if there's a sort of political change in China or something. I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, the China risk is for Apple. This is the astonishing thing about the $3 trillion valuation. And with the new virtual reality headset, that entire production chain is based in China too. Absolutely 100% in China. So, if that's their new big technological breakthrough, it totally replicates the Tim Cook China-based supply chain story. And why should they go anywhere else, right? I mean, sure, India is attractive for political reasons, but the chances of being able in any foreseeable future to really build a competitive chain and ecosystem there are slight, and they know it. Everyone is looking for those options, but the moves on Apple's part are relatively modest in quantitative terms. The reason they stay in the way they do is that Foxconn gives them at least one layer of mediation, right? They're not immediately the employer of hundreds of thousands of Chinese.
So finally, I wanted to ask, why do you think we generally think of Apple as liberal? I mean, this seems to be a pretty amazing marketing feat, given everything we've just discussed, its record on taxes, labor rights, etc. I mean, what is the substance of this political image making? And is this where Apple's vaunted aesthetics come in to give it a kind of liberal reputation?
I was thinking about this question about its aesthetics. I think that's actually really is a really important point. I can't quite think through how the sleekness of these objects fits into, but it does, in my mind, very closely associate with a kind of neo-Californian, enthusiasm of the 90s and the 2000s. I don't think anyone who works inside Apple would be under any illusions about liberalism as such, right? I mean, it's liberal in that it emphasizes privacy as an absolutely prime value, but the corporation itself is incredibly tightly run, very tightly managed. They run regular security sweeps across the company to prevent leaking. It is a very, very tight ship indeed. I mean, it was described in one profile in a Western magazine as a sort of liberal version of China. So that being the kind of the ideal of the company. I mean, that doesn't mean that it suppresses the free speech of its staff, and they are on the liberal end of the Californian spectrum, those based in the US. So, there are tech companies like Qualcomm, for instance, the chip manufacturer, which are pretty much evenly split 50-50 Republican Democrat. There's Peter Thiel's outfit, which of course is hard right leaning. But no, Apple is like most other, the tech firms, the Netflixes and so on, an 80 to 90% Democrat donating business. They were in the crosshairs of some of Trump's early rhetoric, but then in fact they built a very workable relationship with Trump. Tim Cook was one of the tech executives who had the closest relationship with Trump by the end. Trump gave him this moniker, Tim Apple, and Cook, I think it was probably just a slip on Trump's part, but apparently Tim Cook, changed his name on Twitter to Tim Apple, in homage to the president. And they did manage to get Apple exempted from any of Trump's tariffs, right? So, there was a fear that Apple's tech would be subject to the Trump China tariff, and that didn't happen. So, they play the policy, not the politician. I think that's the line from the company. And I have to say, as a European, because I grew up I worked for IBM for a year, and I grew up in computers in the 80s and 90s in Berlin, where there was this strong, left hacker, the global hacker scene. The politics of hacking is really very German in this period, the Chaos Computer Club and these kind of people. And they wouldn't have gone anywhere near an Apple because it being a closed architecture, right? It was clearly a giant corporate lock-in. And we couldn't ever really quite figure out why, supposedly lefty Americans were falling for this corporate, essentially monopolistic play. It took me a long time, as my family will attest, to I've only been on Apple for just 15, not quite 15 years, which by the standards of a liberal academic is very late adopter, right? And it was in the end, it was the design, it was the slimness of the MacBook Air. Just that did it for me. I just couldn't resist that. that knife edge, steely kind of thing was just irresistible.
I do wonder if this is where the aesthetics do come in, though, because, yeah, somehow there's an association between the sleek aesthetics and some sense of open-mindedness. And I think that association has been made by the company explicitly. I remember there was an advertising campaign, Think Different, in the 90s,
Right.
where they sort of tried to associate with free thinkers, etc.
Yeah.
And it's funny how that open-mindedness as a sort of contentless idea, is enough to give one a sense that there is something goodwill there, even if all the other substance of the politics are regressive or conservative, as any corporation, I suppose, would be in protecting its interests. But it's quite a coup to sort of say we're open-minded. The aesthetics, we're open-minded. We associate ourselves with open-minded people, and that's enough to be liberal. I mean, maybe that's more an indictment of liberalism. I don't know.
I was going to say, I know some left-wing friends would say, precisely.
Exactly.
You nailed it, Count. That's exactly what it is. It's about as liberal and free-thinking as a MacBook Air. Sharp enough to cut your head off in an accident.
I'm glad we've
nailed it.
We've backfilled our way to socialism here. Okay. Well, we do have to end up here anyway. But I suspect this won't be the last time we are talking about trillions of dollars. We've been talking about starting maybe an occasional series called Trillion or X Trillion because that threshold struck us as an important one in various contexts. So stick with us in the weeks ahead, and we may be talking about things on this scale again. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.